Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel, a place for curious minds to rest and drift gently into the mysteries of the past. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the Ottoman Empire, a world of towering palaces, shimmering domes, and timeless traditions. Picture the lanterns glowing along the Bosphorus, the markets alive with silks and spices, and the steady march of soldiers whose presence carried both fear and respect across the lands they guarded. For more than 600 years, this empire stretched across 3 continents, blending cultures, shaping trade, and leaving behind wonders that still whisper to us today. These are not stories of conquest alone, but of curious details. Soldiers who became legends, palaces with 1,000 rooms, and mystical traditions that still linger today. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, I invite you to like and subscribe, or share one of your favorite history facts down in the comments. But for now, settle back. Let the centuries drift past like pages in a dream, and allow history to carry you softly toward rest. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. The Ottoman Empire lasted for more than 6 centuries. The story of the Ottoman Empire begins in the late 13th century, when a small band of warriors led by Osman I established a foothold in Anatolia. From this modest beginning, the empire grew steadily, absorbing cities, regions, and cultures, until it stretched across 3 continents. What made it remarkable was not only its size, but its endurance. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire weathered wars, revolutions, shifting alliances, and countless dynasties in Europe and Asia. Few empires in human history have survived so long, ruling over so many people with such a wide reach. Its longevity means that the empire touched an astonishing span of history, beginning before Columbus set sail for the Americas and ending only after the First World War. In a sense, to follow the life of the Ottomans is to trace the shape of half a millennium itself. Janissaries were among the most feared soldiers in history. The Janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, forged through the Devshirme system. Unlike most soldiers of the time, they were highly trained, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Sultan. Their distinctive uniforms, tall headdresses, and fearsome battle cries made them instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Armed with the latest firearms and tactics, they were among the first standing armies in Europe to adopt gunpowder weapons effectively. For centuries, they struck fear into enemies from Hungary to Persia. Yet the Janissaries were more than soldiers. They were also a powerful political force. Over time, their influence grew so great that they sometimes dictated imperial policy and even toppled sultans. Eventually, their power became a threat to the very empire they once protected. Still, for much of Ottoman history, the Janissaries stood as the very embodiment of its military might and reputation. Coffee once faced a death sentence in Istanbul. Today, Turkish coffee is celebrated as one of the empire's most enduring legacies. But there was a time when it was banned outright. In the 16th century, the Sultan issued a decree forbidding the drink. Coffee houses had sprung up across Istanbul, and they quickly became places not just for conversation, but for political debate and satire. Authorities worried that these gatherings might stir unrest or rebellion. Some rulers considered coffee a dangerous stimulant, while others simply feared the gatherings it encouraged. Punishments could be severe, even execution for repeat offenders. But despite the bans, the habit proved irresistible. Secret coffee houses flourished, and the aroma of roasted beans continued to drift through the streets. Eventually, the Ottomans embraced coffee fully, and Istanbul became one of the great coffee capitals of the world. What was once forbidden became a defining feature of Ottoman culture and hospitality. Its capital, Constantinople, was once the greatest city in the world. In 1453, the Ottomans captured Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Renamed Istanbul, it became the beating heart of Ottoman rule. The city's position was unmatched. It straddled Europe and Asia, commanding the Bosphorus Strait, where ships carried spices, silks, and treasures from across the known world. Its walls, once thought unbreachable, had fallen to Ottoman cannons, and within those walls, a new chapter of history unfolded. Istanbul became a crossroads where East met West, where markets buzzed in dozens of languages, and where scholars, artists, and craftsmen gathered under the patronage of sultans. The city's skyline rose with domes and minarets that still enchant travelers today. For centuries, it was one of the largest, richest, and most cosmopolitan cities on Earth. To step into its streets was to feel the pulse of an empire and to glimpse the currents of a world constantly in motion. The Ottomans called themselves rulers of the two lands and the two seas. Titles carried immense weight in the Ottoman world. Sultans were not simply kings or emperors, they were rulers with cosmic ambitions. One of the grand titles the sultans bore was ruler of the two seas and the two lands. The two lands referred to Europe and Asia, the continents bound together by Istanbul itself. The two seas were the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, bodies of water that their fleets sought to control. To call themselves this was to claim dominion over the crossroads of the Old World, a place where continents met and oceans connected. It was a reminder both to themselves and their subjects that they were not provincial rulers, but masters of a realm at the very center of global power. Even in its poetry, the empire announced itself as a civilization of sweeping ambition and immense scope. The Sublime Porte was more than just a gate. The term Sublime Porte often appears in old European texts describing the Ottoman Empire. To outsiders, it seemed a mysterious phrase, almost poetic. In reality, it referred to the grand ceremonial gate of the imperial palace in Istanbul, where official announcements were made and foreign envoys were received. But the meaning quickly expanded beyond architecture. The Sublime Porte became shorthand for the Ottoman government itself, much like the White House stands for the US presidency today. When European diplomats said they negotiated with the Sublime Porte, they meant they were striking deals with the heart of Ottoman authority. The gate was more than wood and stone. It was a symbol of power, ritual, and the carefully staged theater of politics. To pass beneath it was to step into the machinery of one of history's most enduring empires, where decisions rippled outward across continents. Janissaries were among the most feared soldiers in history. The Janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire, forged through the Devshirme system. Unlike most soldiers of the time, they were highly trained, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Sultan. Their distinctive uniforms, tall headdresses, and fearsome battle cries made them instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Armed with the latest firearms and tactics, they were among the first standing armies in Europe to adopt gunpowder weapons effectively. For centuries, they struck fear into enemies from Hungary to Persia. Yet the Janissaries were more than soldiers. They were also a powerful political force. Over time, their influence grew so great that they sometimes dictated imperial policy and even toppled sultans. Eventually, their power became a threat to the very empire they once protected. Still, for much of Ottoman history, the Janissaries stood as the very embodiment of its military might and reputation. Coffee once faced a death sentence in Istanbul. Today, Turkish coffee is celebrated as one of the empire's most enduring legacies, but there was a time when it was banned outright. In the 16th century, the Sultan issued a decree forbidding the drink. Coffee houses had sprung up across Istanbul, and they quickly became places not just for conversation, but for political debate and satire. Authorities worried that these gatherings might stir unrest or rebellion. Some rulers considered coffee a dangerous stimulant, while others simply feared the gatherings it encouraged. Punishments could be severe, even execution for repeat offenders. But despite the bans, the habit proved irresistible. Secret coffee houses flourished, and the aroma of roasted beans continued to drift through the streets. Eventually, the Ottomans embraced coffee fully, and Istanbul became one of the great coffee capitals of the world. What was once forbidden became a defining feature of Ottoman culture and hospitality. The Ottomans had a secret police. Like many empires, the Ottomans relied not only on armies and officials, but also on networks of informants. In Istanbul and beyond, a kind of secret police operated, tasked with keeping watch over potential dissent. They reported on the mood in coffee houses, the whispers in markets, and the activities of powerful families. Sometimes they protected the state from genuine threats. At other times, their reports fueled paranoia at court. Sultans often trusted them more than official advisors, for they provided glimpses into what people said behind closed doors. For ordinary citizens, the knowledge that someone might be listening encouraged caution in speech. The existence of such spies reflected the empire's deep concern with stability and loyalty. In a realm that stretched across continents, even the smallest spark of rebellion was feared, and so unseen ears were always listening in the shadows. The Devshirme system recruited Christian boys into power. One of the empire's most unusual institutions was the Devshirme, often called the blood tax. Christian families in the Balkans were required to give up young boys who were taken to Istanbul. Though it sounds harsh, these boys were not doomed to misery. Instead, they were educated, converted to Islam, and trained for service in the Ottoman state. Some became soldiers, entering the elite Janissary Corps, while others rose to positions of extraordinary influence, serving as administrators, scholars, and even grand viziers. In time, a boy from a remote village could wield power greater than princes in Europe. The Devshirme blurred the lines between conquest and opportunity, creating a system where loyalty was shaped not by birth, but by the empire itself. It was a striking reminder of how the Ottomans built their strength not just through armies, but through people shaped into instruments of state. Ottoman sultans lived in a palace of over 1,000 rooms. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was the seat of Ottoman power for nearly 400 years. More than just a residence, it was a vast city within a city, with over 1,000 rooms, courtyards, gardens, and chambers. Inside its walls lived not only the Sultan and his family, but also ministers, guards, servants, scribes, and scholars. Decisions that shaped the destiny of continents were made in its council halls, while its kitchens prepared meals for thousands daily. Hidden within its inner courtyards lay the harem, a world of mystery and strict rules. The palace was also a treasure house, filled with jewels, manuscripts, weapons, and relics. To wander through Topkapi was to step into the beating heart of an empire, a place where daily life, politics, art, and intrigue were all woven together into one grand, enduring stage of history. The harem was both a home and a center of politics. The word harem often conjures exoticized images in Western imagination, but in reality, the Ottoman harem was a carefully regulated institution. It was the private living quarters of the Sultan's family, wives, concubines, children, and servants, guarded by trusted eunuchs. But beyond being a home, the harem was also a political arena. The women within it, particularly the Sultan's mother and favored consorts, wielded influence over appointments, policies, and even succession. During periods known as the Sultanate of Women, powerful mothers effectively ruled the empire through their sons. The harem was thus both intimate and strategic, a world where family life and statecraft intertwined. Far from being hidden away, the harem's whispers often echoed into the empire's most critical decisions, shaping the course of Ottoman history in ways the outside world could scarcely imagine. At its height, the empire spanned 3 continents. The reach of the Ottoman Empire was truly vast. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, its borders stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, from the mountains of Persia to the coasts of North Africa. It commanded the eastern Mediterranean and controlled the crucial trade routes between Europe and Asia. Few empires in history have ruled over such a diverse tapestry of peoples, languages, and faiths. Arabs, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Serbs, and countless others lived under the crescent banner. Mosques rose beside churches and synagogues, and markets overflowed with goods from Africa, India, and beyond. The empire's diversity was both a source of strength and constant challenge, binding together lands so vast that a traveler could spend months crossing them. To stand at its center was to feel the weight of a world empire, stretching in every direction. The siege of Constantinople changed the world forever. In the spring of 1453, the young Ottoman ruler, Mehmed II, set his sights on Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. For more than 1,000 years, its massive walls had withstood countless sieges. But this time, the world would change. Mehmed brought with him a new weapon, enormous cannons that could shatter stone once thought indestructible. After weeks of relentless bombardment, the Ottomans breached the walls, and on May 29th, the city fell. With it ended the Byzantine Empire, and a new era began. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the shining capital of the Ottomans. To many, it symbolized the dawn of modern history, as the fall of the city spurred Europeans to seek new trade routes, eventually leading to the age of exploration. The siege was not just a military victory, but a turning point that reshaped the destiny of nations. Cannons the size of houses were used to break ancient walls. The fall of Constantinople was made possible by an innovation both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Giant cannons unlike anything the world had seen before. One of these, sometimes called the Great Turkish Bombard, was so massive that it had to be pulled by teams of oxen and required dozens of men to operate. The barrels stretched longer than a man was tall, and the stone balls they fired weighed hundreds of pounds. When fired, the roar echoed for miles, shaking the very earth beneath. For centuries, the walls of Constantinople had been considered invincible, but under the thunder of these new weapons, cracks appeared and stones tumbled. The spectacle was both terrifying and revolutionary. The age of medieval fortresses was ending, and a new era of gunpowder warfare had begun. The Ottomans showed the world that even the mightiest walls could fall under the thunder of iron. The Ottomans controlled some of the richest trade routes on earth. The empire's strength was not built on armies alone, but also on its command of trade. Sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the Ottomans controlled the Silk Road routes that carried spices, silk, and precious stones. They also commanded the waterways of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, ensuring that goods from India, China, and the Middle East passed through their markets. Caravans wound their way across deserts and mountains, while merchant ships glided into the harbors of Istanbul, Aleppo, and Cairo. Customs duties and taxes from this trade brought immense wealth into the empire. But their dominance also pushed European powers to seek alternate routes, sailing westward into the Atlantic and eventually discovering the Americas. In this way, the Ottomans were at the heart of a global economic shift, both benefiting from and unintentionally inspiring the age of exploration. Their naval fleet once ruled the Mediterranean. The Ottomans were not only a land empire, they became a formidable naval power. By the 16th century, their fleets of galleys patrolled the Mediterranean, challenging European powers such as Spain and Venice. At its height, the Ottoman navy controlled key islands, coastal fortresses, and harbors stretching from North Africa to the Aegean. Their admirals, such as the famous Barbarossa, were both feared and admired for their daring tactics. Ottoman sailors were masters of speed and maneuverability, often outpacing larger European ships. For decades, the Mediterranean was virtually an Ottoman lake, where their crescent banners flew proudly above the waves. This dominance allowed the empire to safeguard its trade, project power far from its heartlands, and bring immense pressure on its European rivals. The Mediterranean, once contested by Romans, Byzantines, and Crusaders, now bowed to the might of the Ottoman fleet. Ottoman miniature paintings preserved worlds of color. Art in the Ottoman Empire took many forms, but one of the most enchanting was miniature painting. These were tiny, detailed works created in books and manuscripts, often illustrating histories, battles, festivals, or even scientific texts. They were not meant to be displayed on walls, but to be held close, studied in quiet moments, and admired for their intricate beauty. Colors gleamed with gold, lapis, and rich pigments, showing sultans in their robes, armies on the march, or celebrations in the palace gardens. Miniatures did not aim to capture lifelike perspective, but rather to tell a story through stylized and symbolic imagery. They became windows into the world of the Ottomans, not just how things looked, but how they were imagined and remembered. Through these delicate works, the empire's history was preserved in vivid strokes of light and color that still dazzle today. The call to prayer once echoed across 3 continents. For centuries, the reach of the Ottoman Empire extended so far that the sound of the call to prayer could be heard across 3 continents. From the minarets of Istanbul to the mosques of Cairo to the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of the Balkans, the daily rhythm of life was marked by that familiar voice. It served as a reminder that the empire's vast lands, though filled with different languages and cultures, were bound together by a shared spiritual identity. The architecture of Ottoman mosques ensured that the call carried clearly across cityscapes, weaving sound into the fabric of daily life. For travelers, hearing the same call in distant lands was a sign they remained under the Sultan's rule. The echo across such immense distances became not only a religious expression, but also a symbol of the empire's extraordinary unity and reach. An Ottoman astronomer was once told to stop studying the stars. In the 16th century, an Ottoman astronomer named Taqi al-Din established one of the most advanced observatories of the age in Istanbul. Equipped with giant instruments to measure the heavens, he sought to chart the stars with a precision never seen before. For a time, the project flourished, and he made important observations about the movements of planets and the workings of celestial spheres. But as his fame grew, so did suspicion. Some religious authorities argued that studying the heavens in such a way was unnecessary or even dangerous, believing it encroached on divine mysteries. Eventually, the Sultan, under pressure, ordered the observatory to be demolished. The instruments were destroyed, and the opportunity for further discoveries was lost. It was a moment that showed the tension between curiosity and caution in the empire, how the thirst for knowledge sometimes collided with fear of the unknown. Sultans wore turbans so large they became works of architecture. Ottoman sultans were not only rulers of power, but figures of spectacle. Their clothing reflected the majesty of their station, and none more so than their turbans. These headpieces were enormous, wound from yards upon yards of fine cloth and shaped into towering forms. Some were so large and elaborate that they resembled miniature architectural creations, echoing the domes and curves of the empire's mosques and palaces. To see a sultan in full regalia was to be struck by awe. The turban was not simply fashion, but a symbol of authority, wisdom, and divine favor. Each layer of cloth added to the sense of grandeur, as if the very weight of empire rested upon his brow. In ceremonies and processions, these turbans marked the sultan as more than a man. They framed him as the living embodiment of imperial dignity. Ottoman cuisine blended flavors from every corner of the empire. Food in the Ottoman Empire was a mirror of its diversity. From the spices of Arabia to the olives of the Mediterranean, from the lamb of Anatolia to the rice of Persia, the empire gathered ingredients from across its vast territories. In the kitchens of Topkapi Palace, hundreds of cooks prepared meals for thousands daily, experimenting with flavors that blended east and west. Dishes such as pilaf, kebabs, and rich pastries became staples, often flavored with cinnamon, cloves, and rosewater. Coffee, once banned, eventually took pride of place at the table. Food was more than nourishment, it was a statement of empire. Banquets dazzled foreign guests with variety and abundance, while humble street vendors sold bread, soups, and sweets to city crowds. Ottoman cuisine was thus both royal and everyday, extravagant and simple, a living testament to the empire's cultural and geographic breadth. Tulips became a symbol of imperial splendor. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman elite developed an obsession with tulips. These delicate flowers, originally from Central Asia, became symbols of refinement, beauty, and imperial power. Entire gardens were planted with rare and colorful varieties, and artists wove tulip motifs into fabrics, tiles, and manuscripts. The period became known as the Tulip Era, marked by a fascination with elegance, leisure, and the enjoyment of life's fleeting beauty. For a time, tulips were so prized that bulbs could fetch prices higher than gold. Festivals were held in their honor, with lanterns illuminating gardens at night as guests strolled among blooming petals. The tulip craze eventually passed, but its legacy endured. Even today, the tulip is one of the enduring emblems of Istanbul, reminding us of a time when a simple flower stood as the proud symbol of an empire's grandeur. The Ottomans used a calendar different from Europe's. While European nations measured their years by the Gregorian calendar, the Ottomans relied on their own system. For much of their history, they used a lunar calendar tied to Islamic tradition, where months began with the sighting of the crescent moon. This meant their year was shorter than the solar year of Europe, and festivals and holy days slowly shifted across the seasons. For administration, the Ottomans sometimes blended this lunar calendar with older solar systems, especially when calculating taxes or agricultural cycles. This dual use could cause confusion for diplomats or merchants from outside the empire who struggled to keep track of dates. But within the empire, it reflected a rhythm of life shaped both by faith and practicality. Time itself, in the Ottoman world, carried a different texture, marked by moons and stars, yet carefully aligned with the needs of an empire. An entire city was once built just to house the army. The Ottoman military machine was vast, and at times it required entire cities to sustain it. One remarkable example is Edirne, an imperial capital before Istanbul rose to prominence. The city was strategically placed near the European frontiers, and its infrastructure reflected its role as a military hub. Barracks, armories, training grounds, and vast storehouses filled its streets. When campaigns against Hungary or the Balkans were planned, Edirne served as the staging point, swelling with soldiers, horses, and supplies. Roads and bridges around it were built to handle the flow of men and materials. To outsiders, it looked less like a provincial city and more like a fortress that breathed. Even after Istanbul became the capital, Edirne remained a crucial military base. It was a reminder that the empire's strength was not just in palaces and courts, but in entire cities dedicated to the power of arms. Ottoman bureaucrats kept records that spanned centuries. Behind the grandeur of palaces and the thunder of armies lay the quiet work of scribes. The Ottomans built one of the most meticulous bureaucracies in history, with officials keeping registers of land, taxes, population, and trade. Vast archives recorded the lives of farmers, merchants, soldiers, and nobles alike. Some records detailed which crops were grown in a village, others listed the names of families and the taxes they owed. These documents allowed the empire to administer land stretching from Hungary to Arabia with surprising efficiency. For historians today, they are a treasure trove, revealing how ordinary people lived under Ottoman rule. The precision of this bureaucracy meant that, even across centuries, the empire could recall obligations, settle disputes, or trace ownership. In a world often remembered for its battles, the Ottomans' obsession with record-keeping was one of the quiet foundations of their enduring power. Diplomats called it the sick man of Europe, long before its fall. By the 19th century, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was struggling. Its vast territories were difficult to control. Nationalist movements threatened unity, and European rivals grew stronger by the year. Diplomats in Europe began to call it the sick man of Europe, a phrase that suggested weakness, decline, and inevitable collapse. The term spread quickly, shaping perceptions of the empire even before it had truly fallen. Yet within its borders, life continued. Markets bustled, ships sailed, and palaces glittered. The nickname reflected more the ambitions of European powers than the daily reality of millions of Ottoman subjects. Still, the phrase stuck, casting a shadow over the empire's final century. It served as both an insult and a prophecy, as the once great state that had conquered Constantinople and ruled 3 continents slowly gave way to a new order rising in the modern age. The Blue Mosque still glows with more than 20,000 tiles. One of Istanbul's greatest landmarks is the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, better known as the Blue Mosque. Built in the early 17th century, it was designed to rival the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia across the square. Its nickname comes from the dazzling blue Iznik tiles that cover its interior, numbering more than 20,000. Each tile was hand-painted with intricate patterns of flowers, vines, and geometric shapes, glowing under the light of chandeliers. The mosque is crowned with 6 slender minarets and a cascade of domes that rise like a stone waterfall into the sky. Even today, when visitors step inside, they are enveloped by a serene sea of blue and gold. It remains an active place of worship, as well as a symbol of Ottoman artistry at its peak, a masterpiece where faith, architecture, and beauty blend seamlessly into one timeless whole. The empire's language blended Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. The language of the Ottoman court was unlike any other. Rooted in Turkish, it absorbed thousands of words from Arabic and Persian, creating a rich and layered tongue. Poetry and official documents were written in this Ottoman Turkish, filled with elegant flourishes and expressions borrowed from across cultures. To common people in the countryside, it often sounded foreign, almost like another language entirely. Yet in the palaces and schools of Istanbul, it was the voice of power, law, and art. Calligraphers transformed it into visual beauty, while poets bent it into verses that carried both rhythm and philosophy. This linguistic blending reflected the empire itself, diverse, layered, and always evolving. Though Ottoman Turkish faded after the empire's fall, its influence still lingers in modern Turkish, a reminder of a language that once carried the weight of an empire's voice across continents. Ottoman maps showed the world in unfamiliar shapes. The Ottomans produced maps that reflected both their knowledge and their imagination of the world. One of the most famous was drawn by an admiral named Piri Reis, who created a map of the Atlantic in the early 16th century. It included parts of Europe, Africa, and even the coasts of the Americas, making it one of the earliest known maps to show the New World. Ottoman maps often looked unfamiliar to modern eyes, with coastlines drawn from sailors' reports rather than precise measurements. Mountains, cities, and rivers appeared where experience placed them, not always where they truly lay. These maps were practical tools for navigation, but they were also works of art, filled with colorful illustrations of ships, animals, and mythical creatures. To hold one was to glute both the reach of Ottoman exploration and the wonder of a world still being revealed. Music in the court mixed drums, flutes, and strange harmonies. The music of the Ottoman court was unlike anything heard in Europe. It blended haunting flutes, piercing strings, and the deep, resonant boom of great drums. The imperial bands, called meta, marched with soldiers into battle, their music designed to inspire courage and strike fear into enemies. The rhythms were unusual to foreign ears, built on complex scales and harmonies that sounded exotic and unpredictable. In peaceful settings, music also filled the palace gardens and chambers, accompanying poetry recitations and celebrations. Composers experimented with blending traditions from Persia, Arabia, and the Balkans, creating a soundscape that was both diverse and distinctly Ottoman. To hear it was to be transported, at times uplifting, at times overwhelming, always unforgettable. The music of the court became part of the empire's identity, a symbol of its grandeur and a reminder of the power of sound to shape emotion. The Ottomans once tried to conquer Vienna, twice. For centuries, Vienna stood as the gateway between the Ottoman Empire and the heart of Europe. Twice, Ottoman armies marched against it. The first attempt came in 1529, under Suleiman the Magnificent. His forces surrounded the city, but rain, mud, and stiff resistance forced a retreat. Nearly 150 years later, in 1683, the Ottomans tried again. This time, a massive army laid siege, and once more, the city seemed on the brink of collapse. But a coalition of European forces, led by the King of Poland, arrived in time to save it. The Ottomans were defeated, and their long advance into Europe was halted. These sieges were not just battles, they were turning points. Vienna became a symbol of resistance, and the Ottomans' failure marked the slow shift from expansion to defense. The walls of Vienna stood, and with them, the limits of empire. Coffee houses became places of debate and subversion. By the 16th century, coffee houses had spread across Istanbul, and they quickly became more than just places to drink. Within their smoky interiors, men gathered to discuss poetry, politics, and the affairs of the empire. Storytellers entertained crowds, musicians played, and gossip traveled faster than the ink of scribes. Authorities grew wary. These gatherings encouraged debate, sometimes even criticism of the government, and so coffee houses were seen as hotbeds of subversion. At times they were banned, only to reappear in secret, drawing even larger crowds. Their popularity proved unstoppable. To sit in a coffee house was to connect with the pulse of the city, to sip a strong, bitter cup and join in conversations that stretched from the smallest matters of daily life to the grandest questions of empire. In their own quiet way, coffee houses became arenas where ideas could challenge power. An Ottoman admiral wrote one of the earliest global atlases. In the early 16th century, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis created one of the most remarkable maps of the age. A skilled sailor and cartographer, he combined information from sailors, explorers, and older maps to chart the coasts of Europe, Africa, and even parts of the newly discovered Americas. His work, known as the Book of Navigation, was more than a map. It was a collection of charts, sailing directions, and illustrations that guided ships across distant seas. At a time when the world was still being revealed, Piri Reis's atlas stood as a bridge between old knowledge and new discovery. His maps showed a global vision rarely seen outside Europe, proof that the Ottomans, too, looked outward to the oceans. Today, fragments of his work survive, offering us a glimpse of how the empire imagined the wider world beyond its borders. The sultans claimed the title of Caliph. After conquering much of the Arab world in the 16th century, the Ottoman sultans claimed the title of Caliph, or spiritual leader of the Islamic world. This was more than symbolic. It linked their rule not only to political power, but also to religious authority across millions of people. The title gave the sultans influence in places far beyond their borders, from India to North Africa. For subjects of the empire, the idea that their ruler was both sultan and caliph strengthened loyalty and gave legitimacy to Ottoman rule. It also added a sense of sacred duty to imperial expansion. The claim was sometimes challenged by rivals, but for centuries, the Ottomans were seen as guardians of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. To call themselves caliphs was to present their rule as not just an empire of swords and palaces, but one of faith and unity. Slave markets existed even in the heart of Istanbul. Although the empire is often remembered for its art and architecture, slavery was a persistent reality in Ottoman society. In Istanbul itself, slave markets operated openly, where men, women, and children were bought and sold. Many were war captives, while others came from regions along the Black Sea or North Africa. Slaves served in households, fields, and palaces, some enduring harsh conditions, while others, particularly those in elite households, could rise to positions of influence. Eunuchs guarding the harem, for example, often began their lives as slaves, but became powerful figures in court politics. While this may seem shocking today, it was a widespread practice across much of the world at the time. In the Ottoman Empire, slavery was woven into the fabric of society, a reminder that the grandeur of palaces and mosques existed alongside lives marked by captivity and dependence. The Grand Vizier could be more powerful than the Sultan. At the top of the Ottoman government stood the Grand Vizier, the chief minister who managed the empire's day-to-day affairs. While the Sultan was the ultimate authority, many preferred to remain distant from routine governance. In those cases, the Grand Vizier became the true power behind the throne. He commanded the council, oversaw the treasury, and directed military campaigns. Some Grand Viziers rose from humble origins, elevated by talent and loyalty. Their power could rival and at times overshadow that of the Sultan himself. Foreign ambassadors often negotiated directly with the Grand Vizier, recognizing his immense authority. Yet the position was perilous. A failed war, a poor decision, or the Sultan's suspicion could mean sudden dismissal or execution. To be Grand Vizier was to live in a world of immense influence balanced on a knife's edge, where power and danger walked hand in hand. Ottoman baths were social, religious, and political spaces. Public baths, or hammams, were an essential part of Ottoman life. Rooted in both Roman and Islamic traditions, they were places not only for cleanliness, but also for community. People gathered there to wash, relax, and talk. The baths became social hubs, where news spread, friendships deepened, and deals were made. For women, they provided rare spaces outside the home where they could meet freely, share stories, and celebrate life events such as weddings. The architecture of hammams was striking. Domed ceilings pierced with tiny star-shaped windows that let in shafts of light, illuminating clouds of steam. The experience combined ritual cleansing with a kind of public theater of society. To step into a hammam was to immerse oneself not only in water, but in the shared rhythms of Ottoman urban life, where the personal and political mingled in warm, echoing chambers. The crescent moon became a lasting symbol. The crescent moon, now so strongly associated with the Ottoman Empire and later with many Islamic nations, rose to prominence under Ottoman rule. Though the crescent had older roots in Byzantium and other cultures, the Ottomans embraced it as a powerful emblem of their state. It adorned the flags carried into battle, the minarets of mosques, and the coins struck in the Sultan's name. To subjects of the empire, the crescent represented protection, unity, and divine favor. To outsiders, it became the unmistakable mark of Ottoman power. The symbol endured long after the empire itself collapsed, finding its way onto the flags of many modern nations once ruled by the Ottomans. What began as a simple curve of light in the sky became a lasting sign of identity, linking past and present through a single, enduring image. Their legal system mixed Sharia with imperial law. Governing an empire as vast as the Ottomans required a complex and adaptable legal system. They relied on two main pillars: Sharia, or Islamic law, and Qanun, a set of secular laws issued by the Sultan. Together, these created a balance between tradition and practicality. Sharia guided matters of religion, family, and morality, while the Sultan's laws addressed issues like taxation, property, and military service. This combination allowed the empire to maintain unity while also adapting to the diverse needs of its many peoples. Judges were appointed to oversee cases in towns and villages, ensuring that law reached even the most distant provinces. For subjects of the empire, justice was both a spiritual and imperial matter. This blend of sacred and secular law became one of the foundations of Ottoman governance, helping it endure for centuries across such a wide and varied realm. Court eunuchs held enormous influence behind the scenes. Among the most surprising figures in Ottoman politics were the eunuchs of the court. Castrated men brought from Africa or other regions, they served within the palace, especially guarding the harem. But their role went far beyond that of protectors. Trusted by the Sultan and isolated from family ties, eunuchs became deeply involved in the administration of the empire. They carried messages, managed appointments, and at times controlled access to the Sultan himself. The chief black eunuch, in particular, wielded extraordinary authority, often shaping decisions at the highest levels. To outsiders, they seemed invisible, hidden within the palace walls. Yet in reality, their influence was immense. Through quiet words, subtle alliances, and absolute loyalty to the court, eunuchs became some of the most powerful and enduring figures in Ottoman history, reminding us that true authority sometimes rested in unexpected hands. Their armies marched with flags taller than men. Ottoman armies were as much spectacle as they were force. Among their most striking symbols were their standards and flags, some of which rose taller than the soldiers who carried them. These banners, adorned with crescents, stars, and calligraphy, fluttered above the marching ranks, visible from far across the battlefield. Some standards were topped with horsetails, symbols of rank and power that showed the authority of commanders. To see these banners advancing was to feel the weight of empire itself moving forward. They were not just markers of position, but emblems of identity, unity, and fear. Enemies often described the sight of Ottoman armies as overwhelming, rows of soldiers, the sound of drums and horns, and above it all, the towering flags that seemed to scrape the sky. In war, these banners carried not only cloth and color, but the very spirit of conquest. The empire once owned Mecca and Medina. When the Ottomans expanded into Arabia in the 16th century, they gained control of two of the most sacred cities in the Islamic world, Mecca and Medina. This gave the sultans not only political prestige, but also immense spiritual authority, strengthening their claim to the title of Caliph. The Ottomans maintained the holy sites, funded repairs, and ensured safe passage for pilgrims from across the empire. For subjects thousands of miles away, knowing their ruler was the guardian of the holy cities deepened loyalty and reverence. Caravans laden with gifts and supplies departed from Istanbul each year, a tradition that reminded all of the empire's reach. To hold Mecca and Medina was to claim more than land. It was to protect the beating heart of a faith that stretched across continents, binding millions of people to the Ottoman name. Pilgrims to Mecca were protected by Ottoman soldiers. Every year, thousands of pilgrims journeyed to Mecca for the sacred pilgrimage. The routes stretched across deserts, mountains, and vast stretches of open land, where bandits and raiders often lurked. To ensure their safety, the Ottomans organized armed escorts. Soldiers, often led by high-ranking officials, accompanied caravans carrying not only pilgrims, but also supplies, water, and animals. These caravans became legendary spectacles, long lines of travelers guarded by banners and soldiers in shining armor. The most important of these, the Damascus caravan, departed each year under imperial protection. For the Ottomans, safeguarding the pilgrimage was both a duty and a source of prestige, proving that the empire could defend the faithful even in the harshest conditions. For pilgrims, it was a sign that they were not alone, but carried to their destination under the watchful shield of the empire. The first siege of Vienna sent shockwaves through Europe. In 1529, Suleiman the Magnificent marched northward, leading one of the most formidable armies of the age. His destination was Vienna, the heart of Habsburg power in Central Europe. The Ottomans laid siege to the city, battering its walls and threatening to open the gates to the empire's expansion deeper into Europe. But heavy rains, mud, and fierce resistance hampered the assault. After weeks of fighting, Suleiman withdrew, but the attempt itself stunned Europe. Never before had Ottoman armies pressed so far into the continent's core. The failed siege became a turning point, remembered as the moment when Europe truly grasped the scale of Ottoman ambition. To many, it was a brush with disaster that lingered for generations. For the Ottomans, it was a setback, but also a statement that their reach could extend even to the heart of Europe itself. The Battle of Lepanto halted Ottoman naval expansion. In 1571, one of the largest naval battles in history took place off the coast of Greece. The Ottoman fleet clashed with a coalition of European powers known as the Holy League, led by Spain and Venice. Hundreds of ships filled the sea, their sails swelling with wind, their cannons thundering across the waves. For hours, the battle raged in chaos, until at last the Ottomans were decisively defeated. It was the first major loss for their navy in over a century, halting their expansion across the western Mediterranean. Though the empire remained powerful, the victory emboldened Europe and marked the beginning of a slow shift in naval dominance. The Battle of Lepanto became legendary, celebrated in song, poetry, and art. For the Ottomans, it was a reminder that even their mighty fleets could be challenged, and that the tide of history could turn upon the waves. They once ruled the shores of the Red Sea. The Ottomans expanded not only into Europe and the Mediterranean, but also southward into the Red Sea. Controlling these waters allowed them to safeguard the pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina, while also competing with Portugal for control of trade from India. Fortresses rose along the coasts, and fleets patrolled the waters, ensuring that spices, textiles, and precious goods flowed through Ottoman ports. The Red Sea became a vital artery of empire, linking Africa, Arabia, and the broader Indian Ocean world. By holding its shores, the Ottomans projected power deep into regions that had once seemed beyond their reach. It was a reminder of how vast and adaptable the empire could be, stretching from snowy European mountains to desert sands, from Mediterranean islands to the waters that touched the faraway shores of Africa and Asia. Poetry was considered a virtue of rulers. In the Ottoman world, poetry was not a pastime, but a mark of refinement and wisdom. Many sultans, including Suleiman the Magnificent, composed verses that are still admired today. Poetry was seen as a reflection of intellect, a ruler's ability to capture beauty, faith, and emotion in words. Courts hosted gatherings where poems were recited, often accompanied by music, creating evenings of art and contemplation. To write poetry was to prove that one was not merely a warrior or administrator, but a man of culture and spirit. This tradition reflected the broader values of the empire, where literature and art were woven into the fabric of leadership. For the Ottomans, the pen could be as mighty as the sword, and a ruler's verses could carry weight long after battles were forgotten, echoing through the centuries in quiet lines of rhythm and rhyme. The Ottomans used shadow puppets for satire. Amid the grandeur of palaces and the seriousness of politics, the Ottomans also loved humor. One of the most popular entertainments was shadow puppetry. Behind a screen, puppeteers projected figures of leather and wood, casting silhouettes that acted out comedies, tragedies, and biting satire. The most famous characters were Karagöz and Hasidat, one foolish and blunt, the other clever and pretentious. Through their antics, audiences laughed at the follies of daily life, but also at sly criticisms of officials and policies. The plays were a safe way to poke fun at authority, disguising sharp commentary in the cloak of comedy. Performed in coffee houses, fairs, and festivals, shadow puppets entertained both common people and elites. For centuries, their playful banter reminded the empire that even in the world of sultans and viziers, laughter had its place, and humor could carry truths that power alone could not silence. A sultan once ordered the execution of all his brothers. Succession in the Ottoman Empire was often a matter of blood and fear. To prevent civil wars, it became customary for new sultans to eliminate their brothers, ensuring no rival could challenge the throne. One of the most infamous examples came with Mehmed III, who ordered the execution of 19 brothers shortly after his ascension. It was a brutal practice, but it was justified at the time as a way to protect the stability of the empire. To outside observers, it seemed shocking, but within the palace, it was seen as grim necessity. Eventually, the Ottomans abandoned this custom, replacing it with the practice of confining potential heirs in the palace instead. Still, the memory of those executions lingers as one of the darkest traditions of Ottoman politics, a reminder that the price of empire often fell upon the family itself. The sultans loved hunting with falcons. For Ottoman sultans, hunting was more than sport. It was a display of power, skill, and tradition. One of their favorite pastimes was falconry, the art of training birds of prey to hunt. Falcons and hawks, kept in special aviaries within the palace, were cared for by dedicated keepers. Hunts were grand events, with sultans riding out on horseback, their birds perched on gloved hands. When released, the falcons soared through the sky, diving with breathtaking speed to capture their prey. These hunts were not only demonstrations of royal leisure, but also symbols of dominance over nature. They echoed traditions stretching back to Central Asian nomads, connecting the Ottoman rulers to their Turkic ancestors. To watch a falcon return to its master's arm was to witness both beauty and discipline, a ritual that embodied the empire's balance of elegance and control. They perfected the art of siege warfare. The Ottomans became legendary for their ability to capture cities. Siege warfare was their specialty, honed over centuries of campaigns. Their armies surrounded fortresses with trenches, towers, and artillery, cutting off supplies and bombarding walls until defenders could hold no longer. The use of massive cannons at Constantinople was just one example of their mastery. Engineers designed ingenious methods to undermine walls, while sappers dug tunnels to weaken defenses. At the same time, the Ottomans combined patience with psychological pressure, often offering terms of surrender before launching their final assaults. To European observers, their sieges seemed unstoppable, a terrifying demonstration of persistence and power. For the empire, sieges were not merely battles, but the very method by which they expanded their rule, city by city, fortress by fortress, until an empire stretched across continents. The Topkapi dagger is still one of the world's most famous treasures. In the vaults of Topkapi Palace rests a dagger that has become legendary. Crafted in the 18th century, the Topkapi dagger is adorned with emeralds so large they seem almost unreal, glittering in the golden hilt. The weapon was intended as a diplomatic gift to a Persian ruler, but it never left Istanbul after the Shah's sudden death. Instead, it became part of the imperial treasury, where it dazzled visiting dignitaries with its opulence. Today, it is one of the most famous artifacts of the Ottoman Empire, a symbol of wealth and artistry. Yet it is more than a weapon. It embodies the empire's taste for luxury, its flair for craftsmanship, and the delicate role of gifts in diplomacy. The dagger remains a reminder that power was not only asserted through armies and conquests, but also through glittering objects meant to awe and impress. The empire was once ruled by a teenage sultan. The throne of the Ottomans did not always fall to seasoned rulers. Mehmed II, later called the Conqueror, first ascended as a teenager. At just 12 years old, he briefly ruled before being replaced by his father's return to the throne. A few years later, he claimed power again, this time determined to hold it. By 19, he led the conquest of Constantinople, a feat that earned him a permanent place in history. Other young sultans also found themselves thrust into leadership, sometimes unprepared for the immense responsibilities of empire. Their reigns could be marked by turbulence, with advisors and viziers guiding or manipulating them. Yet the empire endured, its structures often stronger than any single ruler. The story of teenage sultans is a reminder of how the weight of history sometimes rested on very young shoulders, shaping their destiny before adulthood had even begun. The Ottomans had entire guilds for different trades. Life in Ottoman cities was organized through guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants who shared the same trade. There were guilds for bakers, butchers, tailors, weavers, metalworkers, and countless others. Each guild regulated prices, trained apprentices, and upheld standards of quality. They also played important roles in festivals, parades, and public life, often marching through the streets in colorful processions that displayed their skills. Membership was a source of pride and identity, binding individuals into a community of shared knowledge. Guilds were not only economic units, but also social and political ones, sometimes negotiating with authorities on behalf of their members. In a world where trade connected continents, guilds ensured that daily life, from bread on the table to the clothes on one's back, was supported by networks of tradition and craft. They were the quiet foundation upon which cities like Istanbul thrived. Their diplomats used secret codes and ciphers. In an empire that spanned continents, information was as powerful as armies. Ottoman diplomats and officials often relied on secret codes and ciphers to protect their communications. Letters were written in disguised scripts or with numerical substitutions that only trusted AIs could decipher. Ambassadors sent abroad carried coded reports back to Istanbul, ensuring that sensitive information could not be easily intercepted. These practices mirrored the espionage networks of Europe, where hidden messages and invisible inks were also in use. The Ottomans knew that power required secrecy and that words could be as dangerous as weapons. While soldiers marched with banners and drums, scribes worked quietly with ink and symbols, guarding the thoughts of the empire. These codes, though simple by modern standards, gave the Ottomans an edge in diplomacy, allowing them to maneuver in a world where intrigue was constant and trust was always fragile. Foreign ambassadors waited hours outside the imperial gate. Diplomacy at the Ottoman court was not swift or casual. When foreign ambassadors came to present themselves, they often waited for hours, sometimes in the burning sun or the chill of dawn, outside the gates of the Topkapi Palace. This was not neglect, but ritual. The long waits reinforced the grandeur and superiority of the empire, reminding envoys that they were dealing with a power greater than their own. When finally admitted, they were led through elaborate courtyards, surrounded by soldiers and officials until they reached the audience chamber. There, the Sultan might say little, allowing the spectacle itself to speak. The entire experience was carefully choreographed to leave an impression of awe. For the Ottomans, diplomacy was theater as much as negotiation, where even the silence of waiting at the gate became a message about the majesty and patience of imperial power. The Ottomans mastered the use of gunpowder early on. From the 15th century onward, the Ottomans were among the pioneers of gunpowder warfare. Their armies fielded cannons, muskets, and handheld firearms at a time when many European states still relied primarily on bows and crossbows. The thunder of Ottoman artillery became legendary, most famously at the fall of Constantinople, but also in countless sieges and battles afterward. Soldiers trained in the disciplined use of firearms gave the empire an edge against rivals. Gunpowder also transformed their navy, equipping ships with rows of cannons that dominated seas and rivers. To neighbors, the Ottomans seemed to wield the power of thunder itself, reshaping the very nature of war. Their early mastery of gunpowder was one of the secrets of their expansion, proving that innovation and technology could decide the fate of empires as surely as bravery and numbers on the battlefield. The tugra was more than just a signature. Every Ottoman sultan had a tugra, a calligraphic emblem that served as his official signature. These elaborate designs, drawn with sweeping curves and flourishes, were placed on royal decrees, coins, and buildings. But a tugra was more than a name. It was a work of art, unique to each sultan and instantly recognizable. Crafted by master calligraphers, the design combined beauty with authority. To see a tugra was to know the word carried the weight of the empire itself. For common people, it symbolized the unseen hand of the sultan in daily life, appearing on documents that shaped taxes, property, and trade. Today, tugras are admired not only as symbols of power, but as masterpieces of calligraphy, blending language and art into a single emblem. They remind us that for the Ottomans, even the simplest act of signing a name became an expression of grandeur. They had a complex system of tax farming. To manage taxation across vast lands, the Ottomans relied on a system known as tax farming. Instead of collecting taxes directly, the state auctioned the right to collect them in a particular region to the highest bidder. These individuals, known as tax farmers, paid an upfront sum to the treasury, then kept a portion of what they gathered from peasants and merchants. The system ensured steady revenue for the empire, but it also created opportunities for abuse, as farmers sometimes demanded more than was fair. Yet it reflected the practical challenges of governing so many provinces with limited bureaucracy. Tax farming tied local elites into the empire's structure, giving them a stake in its success. Though imperfect, it allowed the Ottomans to finance their armies, palaces, and roads, turning the wealth of fields and markets into the power that sustained their empire for centuries. The sultans sometimes commissioned entire cities. Ottoman sultans did not only build mosques and palaces, sometimes they founded entire cities. These were planned with mosques at the center, surrounded by markets, schools, baths, and caravanserais for travelers. The city of Süleymaniye in Istanbul, with its grand mosque complex built by Suleiman the Magnificent, was practically a city within a city. Other towns, like those along key trade routes, were shaped by imperial command, rising out of fields and plains as carefully designed hubs of life. These foundations were not just acts of charity or grandeur, but also practical tools of control, anchoring the empire in distant regions. To build a city was to stamp the land with the mark of empire, ensuring loyalty, prosperity, and faith flowed together. Even today, many of these imperial foundations remain thriving centers, living monuments to the vision of sultans who dreamed in stone and mortar. They preserved ancient Roman aqueducts. When the Ottomans captured lands once ruled by Rome and Byzantium, they inherited vast networks of aqueducts, the ancient systems that carried water to cities. Rather than abandon them, the Ottomans repaired, expanded, and preserved these marvels of engineering. In Istanbul, the Great Valens Aqueduct, built over 1,000 years earlier, continued to channel water under Ottoman care. They built new conduits and cisterns, blending ancient designs with their own innovations. Water was not only essential for drinking and bathing, but also for the hammams, fountains and gardens that defined Ottoman urban life. By maintaining these aqueducts, the Ottomans connected their empire to the legacies of Rome, proving that great civilizations often build upon the stones of those who came before. The flow of water across centuries became a quiet symbol of continuity, where ancient arches and Ottoman domes shared the same lifeblood of cities. The Ottomans once controlled the Holy Land. When the Ottomans expanded into the Levant in the 16th century, they gained control of Jerusalem and the broader Holy Land. This gave them stewardship not only over Islamic holy sites, but also over Christian and Jewish places of worship. For centuries, the empire maintained the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Western Wall, balancing responsibilities that carried immense symbolic weight. Pilgrims from across the world arrived to visit these sacred spaces, and Ottoman officials ensured their protection and maintenance. For the sultans, ruling the Holy Land strengthened their claim as guardians of faith and history. It also tied the empire into the broader religious currents of the world, making Jerusalem a place where spiritual devotion and imperial politics met. Under Ottoman care, the Holy Land became both a center of worship and a symbol of their global stature. Pilgrimage routes were guarded like imperial roads. The Ottoman Empire treated pilgrimage not just as a spiritual duty, but as an imperial responsibility. Each year, thousands journeyed across deserts and mountains to reach the holy cities. To ensure their safety, the Ottomans fortified caravan routes, built wells and rest stations, and stationed soldiers along dangerous stretches. These routes became lifelines that linked distant provinces to the heart of faith. Caravans traveled like moving cities, filled with pilgrims, animals, food, and supplies, all under the protection of imperial banners. For the sultans, guarding these paths showed their commitment as caliphs and rulers, weaving loyalty into the very roads themselves. The safety of a pilgrim reflected the strength of the empire. To walk those routes was to feel not only devotion, but also the reassuring presence of soldiers and guides who embodied the Sultan's promise of protection across lands vast and unforgiving. The palace kitchens fed thousands every day. Within the Topkapi Palace, the kitchens were as grand as the council halls. Dozens of chimneys rose above them, serving vast rooms where hundreds of cooks worked tirelessly. Every day, they prepared meals not only for the Sultan and his family, but also for officials, guards, scholars, and visitors. It is said that as many as 4,000 people could be fed in a single day. The kitchens contained enormous cauldrons, each large enough to cook meals for hundreds, bubbling with stews, rice dishes, and rich soups. Delicacies such as sweets, sherbets, and pastries were crafted for the palace elite, while simpler fare sustained the rest. The kitchens were more than a place of food, they were a symbol of abundance and generosity. To feed thousands each day reflected the empire's wealth and organization, where nourishment became part of the very fabric of rule. They invented their own styles of calligraphy. Calligraphy held a special place in Ottoman culture. More than mere writing, it was considered an art form that blended beauty with meaning. The Ottomans developed their own distinctive styles, shaping Arabic script into elegant, flowing forms that adorned mosques, palaces, and manuscripts. Calligraphers were highly respected, trained for years to master the balance of line, proportion, and rhythm. Their work decorated the domes of great mosques, the margins of royal decrees, and the covers of precious books. Each stroke carried both visual grace and spiritual weight, for writing was seen as a way to reflect divine beauty. The sultans themselves sometimes practiced calligraphy, seeing it as a noble pursuit. These scripts remain admired today, reminding us that in the Ottoman world, even words could be transformed into art, an art that was silent yet powerful, enduring long after voices faded into history. Ottoman coins traveled across the known world. The reach of Ottoman power could be measured not only in armies but in coins. Minted in gold, silver, and copper, Ottoman coins carried the tugra of the reigning sultan, spreading his authority far beyond Istanbul. They were used in markets stretching from the Balkans to Arabia and from North Africa to the Persian frontier. Some even traveled farther, carried along trade routes into India, Europe, and beyond. The coins reflected the empire's wealth, but also its influence in global commerce. For merchants, holding Ottoman currency was a sign of trust in its stability and reach. The designs were often simple, yet they symbolized the unseen hand of the empire in daily life, jingling in purses, exchanged for bread, cloth, or spices. In a world connected by trade, Ottoman coins became small but powerful ambassadors, linking distant peoples through the shared language of commerce. The empire had an elite corps of palace gardeners. Among the many servants of the Ottoman court, few had a role as unique as the palace gardeners. On the surface, they tended the vast gardens of Topkapi Palace, pruning roses, cultivating tulips, and maintaining the orchards that fed the imperial kitchens. But these gardeners were no ordinary laborers. They were an elite corps, trained in discipline and loyalty, who also served as a kind of executioner's guard. When ordered, they carried out punishments or executions within the palace walls. Their dual role gave them an aura of both beauty and fear, caretakers of blossoms by day, silent instruments of justice when called upon. To visitors, the palace gardens seemed serene and filled with fragrance, but behind that serenity stood men whose duties blended life and death. They embodied the paradox of an empire that balanced refinement with ruthless control. Their architecture inspired buildings far beyond their borders. The domes and minarets of Ottoman architecture became some of the most recognizable silhouettes in the world. Inspired by Byzantine models, yet uniquely their own, Ottoman architects developed a style that combined harmony, symmetry, and grandeur. The great mosques of Istanbul, with their cascading domes and slender towers, influenced builders as far away as the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Even in Europe, travelers marveled at the scale and beauty of Ottoman structures, which often blended gardens, fountains, and courtyards into a holistic design. The architect Sinan, in particular, created masterpieces that rivaled the wonders of Rome, earning him lasting fame. Ottoman architecture was not only about religion, but also about civic life, with caravanserais, bridges, and baths shaping cities. Their buildings became living monuments to an empire whose vision was written in stone, echoing across lands long after the builders themselves were gone. The Janissaries eventually became too powerful to control. For centuries, the Janissaries were the backbone of Ottoman military power, feared and respected across the world. But as time passed, their influence grew beyond the battlefield. They gained privileges, wealth, and political voice, and soon they were no longer simply soldiers, but a powerful class of their own. They resisted reforms, opposed change, and even staged uprisings against sultans. At times, they decided who would sit upon the throne, making them both protectors and threats to the empire. By the 19th century, their defiance became so dangerous that Sultan Mahmud II abolished the corps in a violent crackdown known as the Auspicious Incident. Thousands were killed or dispersed, and the Janissaries vanished as a force. Their rise and fall reflected the challenge of any empire. When a tool of strength grows too powerful, it can become the very danger it was meant to guard against. The tulip mania of Istanbul preceded the Dutch craze. Long before tulips became a symbol of wealth in 17th century Holland, the Ottomans had already fallen under their spell. In Istanbul, tulips became prized possessions of the elite, cultivated in palace gardens and celebrated in poetry and art. Entire festivals were devoted to their beauty, where guests wandered by lantern light among fields of glowing blossoms. Tulips came to symbolize refinement, elegance, and the fleeting nature of life. The obsession became so intense that rare bulbs fetched extraordinary prices and new varieties were sought like treasures. This period, known as the Tulip Era, reflected a time of leisure and luxury in Ottoman society. While the craze eventually faded, it left a lasting imprint on Ottoman culture. The tulip remained a cherished emblem of the empire, reminding us how a simple flower could capture the imagination of a civilization and become a symbol of its golden age. A sultan once married a slave who became a queen. One of the most remarkable stories of the Ottoman court is that of Roxilana, also known as Hürrem Sultan. Born far from Istanbul, likely in what is now Ukraine, she was captured and brought to the Ottoman harem as a slave. Through intelligence, charm, and determination, she won the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Breaking tradition, he married her, a rare honor for a concubine, and she became his queen. From then on, she wielded extraordinary influence, advising the Sultan and involving herself in politics, charity, and diplomacy. Her story transformed the perception of the harem from a place of seclusion to one of political power. Roxilana's rise from slavery to queenship remains one of history's most fascinating tales. A reminder that even within the rigid structures of empire, individuals could reshape destiny and leave their mark on the world. The Ottomans borrowed technology from their rivals. Though the empire often seemed unstoppable, the Ottomans never relied on strength alone. They carefully observed their rivals and borrowed innovations that could enhance their own power. European cannons, naval designs from Venice, and administrative methods from Persia all found their way into Ottoman systems. This willingness to adapt made the empire unusually flexible, blending traditions and technologies into something uniquely its own. Ottoman gunsmiths refined European weapons, architects blended Byzantine techniques with Islamic artistry, and naval engineers experimented with shipbuilding styles taken from enemies they had once fought. The empire's success lay not just in conquest, but in its ability to absorb and transform outside knowledge. In this way, every battle and every treaty became not only a test of power, but an opportunity to learn. The Ottomans showed that empires endure not by clinging to the old, but by adapting to the new. They ruled over dozens of languages. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, bringing together a patchwork of peoples who spoke dozens of languages. Turkish served as the administrative tongue, while Arabic carried religious weight, and Persian filled poetry and scholarship. But in markets and villages, people spoke Greek, Armenian, Kurdish, Serbo-Croatian, Albanian, and many more. In some cities, 5 or 6 languages could be heard in a single street. Translators were indispensable, serving as bridges between officials and subjects. The diversity of tongues was both a challenge and a source of richness, shaping an empire where communication itself became a form of diplomacy. For many, being multilingual was simply a way of life. This web of languages reflected the empire's vastness and complexity, a world where people lived under the same banner but carried countless voices, each one adding to the chorus of the Ottoman realm. Some of their palaces had walls of stained glass. The Ottomans loved light, and in some of their most beautiful palaces, they designed windows of stained glass that turned sunlight into dazzling color. In Topkapi Palace and other imperial residences, rooms glowed with blues, reds, and golds as the sun passed overhead. These glass walls were crafted by skilled artisans, combining intricate patterns with radiant hues. They created a sense of wonder and serenity, as if the rooms themselves were alive with shifting colors. Beyond beauty, stained glass symbolized refinement, linking the empire to both Islamic traditions of geometric art and European styles of window making. To sit in a chamber where sunlight passed through jewel-colored panes was to feel the luxury of an empire that valued both power and poetry. These glowing walls whispered of a court that understood beauty as a form of authority, shaping spaces where rulers and guests alike were dazzled. The sultans kept exotic animals in their menageries. Ottoman sultans, like rulers across the world, collected animals from faraway lands to demonstrate their power and wealth. Within palace grounds, menageries held lions, leopards, elephants, and birds brought from Africa, India, and beyond. These creatures were gifts from foreign rulers or spoils of trade, symbols of the empire's connections across continents. Visitors marveled at the menageries, where wild beasts roamed in enclosures that seemed both strange and wondrous. The presence of such animals was not only for spectacle, they were living tokens of diplomacy, reminders that the empire's reach extended into the most distant corners of the known world. To see a lion in Istanbul, far from its natural home, was to be reminded of the Sultan's ability to gather the marvels of nature itself. The menageries were thus both curiosities and declarations of the empire's grandeur and global ties. A sultan once commissioned a golden throne for diplomacy. Among the treasures of the Ottoman court was a throne crafted of solid gold, encrusted with jewels. Commissioned in the 17th century, it was not meant for everyday use, but for the careful theater of diplomacy. When foreign envoys arrived, the throne was displayed to dazzle them, its brilliance reflecting the wealth and majesty of the Sultan. Sometimes it was even sent abroad as a gift, a glittering symbol of goodwill and authority. The throne was more than furniture. It was a political tool designed to impress, intimidate, and persuade without a word spoken. To sit upon it was to embody empire itself, as if the very weight of gold underscored the gravity of decisions being made. Even today, the Golden Throne remains a reminder of how the Ottomans understood the subtle art of diplomacy, where splendor itself could be as powerful as armies. The Ottomans maintained one of the largest standing armies. For much of their history, the Ottomans maintained one of the largest permanent armies in the world. Unlike medieval European kingdoms, which often relied on temporary levies, the Ottomans fielded a professional force year-round. The Janissaries formed the core, supported by cavalry, artillery, and auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. This standing army allowed the sultans to respond quickly to threats, wage extended campaigns, and project power across continents. Soldiers received salaries, uniforms, and regular training, making them a formidable and disciplined force. The empire's ability to sustain such numbers reflected its wealth and organization. To neighbors, the sight of Ottoman armies on the march, endless lines of infantry, horsemen and cannons, was overwhelming. Their presence was both a shield and a sword, ensuring that the empire could defend itself while continuing its expansion for centuries. They created special schools for future officials. The Ottomans understood that ruling such a vast empire required more than soldiers, it required trained administrators. To prepare them, they established special schools within the palace. Promising boys, often chosen through the devshirm system, were educated in languages, mathematics, history, and the intricacies of statecraft. They also learned etiquette, diplomacy, and the arts, shaping them into well-rounded officials ready to serve the empire. Some of these students rose to the highest offices, becoming viziers, generals, or governors. The schools were rigorous, demanding discipline and loyalty above all. In this way, the Ottomans ensured a steady supply of capable leaders who owed their position directly to the state. The palace schools became engines of governance, transforming ordinary boys into extraordinary figures who guided the empire's destiny, showing how carefully the Ottomans nurtured the very machinery of their rule. The Sultan's processions were carefully choreographed spectacles. When the Sultan appeared in public, it was never a casual affair. His processions through the streets of Istanbul were carefully staged events designed to inspire awe. Soldiers marched in precise formation, banners fluttered, musicians played thunderous rhythms, and courtiers followed in glittering robes. At the center rode the Sultan himself, often on horseback, surrounded by guards and officials. These processions marked important occasions, festivals, military victories, or religious ceremonies, and they reminded the people of the majesty of their ruler. To witness one was to be enveloped in sound, color, and movement, as if the empire itself were parading before your eyes. Every detail was deliberate, from the height of the banners to the order of marches. Such spectacles were more than celebration. They were political theater, reinforcing the Sultan's image as both a distant sovereign and a living symbol of empire. Entire villages were relocated by imperial command. The power of the Ottoman state could reach into the smallest corners of daily life. At times, entire villages were ordered to move, relocated by imperial decree. These resettlements served many purposes, populating newly conquered lands, strengthening frontiers, or supplying labor to cities and farms. Families might be uprooted from one region and sent hundreds of miles away, carrying their traditions, skills, and dialects with them. For the empire, this was a way to shape demographics and ensure loyalty in strategic areas. For the people themselves, it was often disruptive, a sudden shift that changed the course of generations. Yet these movements also spread cultures, mixing communities and creating new identities across the empire. The practice reflected the Ottomans' view of subjects as part of a vast tapestry that could be rearranged at will, woven and rewoven to suit the needs of statecraft. The empire once banned printing in Arabic script. When printing presses spread across Europe in the 15th century, books became cheaper and knowledge more accessible. But in the Ottoman Empire, the story was different. For centuries, printing in Arabic script, the script used for Ottoman Turkish, was banned. Scribes, whose livelihoods depended on hand-copying manuscripts, resisted the change, and religious authorities worried that printed texts might contain errors in sacred writings. As a result, books in the empire continued to be copied by hand, long after Europe had embraced mass printing. This slowed the spread of ideas, though it also preserved the artistry of manuscript culture. Eventually, printing in Arabic script was allowed, but the delay meant the Ottomans entered the age of print cautiously. The ban reflects the tension between tradition and innovation in the empire. a civilization balancing reverence for the old with hesitation toward the new. The Ottomans made peace treaties that lasted centuries. Not every Ottoman achievement was forged by sword or cannon. Some of their most enduring triumphs came from diplomacy. The empire signed treaties with powers such as Venice, agreements that sometimes lasted for centuries. These long-standing pacts regulated trade, secured borders, and allowed both sides to profit from stability rather than conflict. Such treaties showed the Ottomans' pragmatism, recognizing that cooperation could yield more lasting power than endless war. While battles made headlines in their time, it was these carefully negotiated accords that quietly stitched together regions, keeping commerce flowing across seas and deserts. For merchants and travelers, the benefits were felt every day. Markets filled with goods, caravans moving safely, and ships sailing under protected flags. The Ottomans demonstrated that empire was not only about conquest, but also about the art of maintaining peace, weaving agreements that outlived generations. Their capitals were filled with public fountains. Walking through an Ottoman city meant hearing the sound of water. Fountains stood on street corners, beside mosques, and within courtyards, offering refreshment to residents and travelers alike. In Istanbul, public fountains became architectural jewels, adorned with calligraphy, floral carvings, and tiled mosaics. Built by sultans, officials, or wealthy patrons, they served both a practical and charitable purpose. In an empire where hospitality was a virtue, to provide water was to perform an act of generosity. These fountains were often social spaces, where neighbors gathered, children played, and passers-by paused to rest. Some became landmarks, known for their elegance and craftsmanship. Even centuries later, many of these fountains still flow, reminders of a culture that valued public welfare as much as grandeur. To drink from one was to taste the care of empire, where beauty and necessity met in stone and water. A sultan once built a mosque in just 7 months. In the heart of Istanbul stands the Yeni Valide Mosque, a testament to the empire's power of determination. One sultan, eager to honor his mother and demonstrate his strength, ordered the construction of a great mosque and commanded that it be finished in only 7 months. Thousands of workers toiled day and night, hauling stone, carving marble, and raising domes with astonishing speed. The result was a structure both magnificent and improbable, completed in record time. While many Ottoman mosques took years, even decades, to build, this one rose almost overnight by comparison. The story reflects the empire's ability to mobilize vast resources where the will of a ruler could bend time itself. For those who saw it rise, the mosque was not only a place of worship, but also a symbol of relentless imperial will, carved into the very skyline of Istanbul. The Ottomans gave sanctuary to Jewish refugees from Spain. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in the late 15th century, many fled across the seas in desperation. The Ottoman Empire opened its doors, welcoming thousands of refugees who had been cast out of Europe. Ships carried families to Istanbul, Salonika, and other Ottoman cities, where they were granted land, homes, and the freedom to rebuild their lives. The sultans saw opportunity and compassion, recognizing that these newcomers brought valuable skills in trade, medicine, and learning. The Jewish communities thrived, establishing schools, synagogues, and businesses that enriched the empire for generations. Their survival became a living testament to the Ottomans' role as a crossroads of cultures and faiths. For the refugees, it was a deliverance, from persecution to protection. And for the empire, it was a reminder that strength could also lie in openness, weaving new lives into its vast tapestry. The empire struggled with rebellions from within. Though vast and powerful, the Ottoman Empire was never free from unrest. Provinces rose in rebellion when taxes grew too heavy, or when distant governors clashed with the central court. In Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Arab provinces, uprisings flared across the centuries, sometimes smoldering for years before being crushed. Even within the heart of the empire, the Janissaries themselves, once loyal guardians of the Sultan, occasionally revolted, demanding higher pay or resisting reforms. These rebellions revealed the challenges of ruling such a sprawling, diverse realm. To hold it together required not only armies, but constant negotiation, concession, and sometimes ruthless suppression. The rebellions remind us that empire was not a smooth story of unbroken power. Beneath the domes and palaces, it was also a world of fragile balances, where loyalty could fracture, and the weight of authority was always tested. A sultan once died during a siege in Europe. In 1566, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most celebrated of Ottoman rulers, marched once more into Europe at the head of his army. Though in his 70s, he refused to retreat into old age, determined to lead his soldiers as he always had. At the siege of Sighet in Hungary, Suleiman passed away in his tent. His death kept secret by his commanders, so the army would not lose heart. The siege was eventually won, but the loss of its great leader marked the end of an era. Suleiman's campaigns had carried the empire to its greatest heights, and his passing on the battlefield seemed both fitting and poignant. To his soldiers, he remained the warrior sultan to the very end, a ruler who had lived and died with empire, always at the edge of his sword. Ottoman scholars debated the movement of the planets. Within the empire's libraries and observatories, scholars turned their eyes skyward. They debated the motion of the planets, comparing ancient Greek theories with Islamic astronomy and the emerging ideas from Europe. Some clung to the traditional model, with Earth at the center of the cosmos, while others dared to suggest the sun might hold that place. Though the Ottomans did not fully embrace the heliocentric system, their debates show a world engaged in the great questions of science. Astronomers calculated eclipses, mapped the heavens, and refined calendars, blending curiosity with tradition. Their discussions reveal the empire as part of the broader conversation of human thought, connected to both the past and the discoveries yet to come. To sit in those debates was to feel the vastness of possibility as minds wrestled with the very order of the universe. They produced libraries filled with manuscripts. Across the empire, knowledge was preserved in ink and parchment. The Ottomans produced libraries filled with manuscripts on history, medicine, astronomy, and poetry. Skilled calligraphers copied texts by hand, sometimes illuminating them with gold and intricate designs. Each book was a work of art, a marriage of knowledge and beauty. Libraries were built within mosques, palaces, and schools, creating centuries of learning where scholars could study for hours beneath high domes and quiet arches. These manuscripts connected the Ottomans to centuries of wisdom, stretching back to Greece, Persia, and the Islamic Golden Age. Many of these collections survive today, their pages still whispering of an empire that valued the written word as much as the sword. In a world often remembered for its battles, the libraries remind us of the quieter victories, those of knowledge preserved and passed on. The empire had its own postal system. Long before modern mail, the Ottomans built a network to carry messages swiftly across their vast lands. Couriers on horseback relayed letters from one station to another, with fresh horses waiting at every stop. Important decrees could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, reaching governors, generals, and foreign rulers. Inns and relay posts dotted major routes, serving both the couriers and the travelers who followed them. This system gave the empire a vital thread of connection, binding together provinces spread from North Africa to Eastern Europe. For merchants and diplomats, it offered a measure of speed and certainty in a world where news often traveled slowly. To imagine these riders galloping across plains and mountains is to picture the pulse of empire itself, a heartbeat of communication that kept power flowing from the Sultan's court to the farthest frontiers. Coffee houses spread from Istanbul into Europe. What began as a novelty in Istanbul soon traveled westward. Ottoman coffee culture crossed into Europe through trade and diplomacy, with coffee houses appearing in Venice, London, and Paris. At first, some Europeans viewed coffee with suspicion, calling it exotic or even dangerous. But soon, the allure of the dark drink won them over. Coffee houses became hubs of conversation, commerce, and philosophy, just as they had been in the Ottoman world. Merchants and envoys carried not only the beans, but the rituals surrounding them, the sharing of stories, the lingering over steaming cups, the sense of community they created. In time, coffee houses helped fuel the Enlightenment itself, as thinkers gathered to debate ideas over Ottoman-inspired brews. From the bustling streets of Istanbul to the salons of Europe, coffee carried with it the legacy of an empire, one sip, one conversation at a time. The Ottomans once ruled the shores of North Africa. From the 16th century onward, the Ottomans extended their reach across the Mediterranean. They gained control over the coastlines of modern-day Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, turning these regions into provinces of the empire. North Africa gave them harbors for fleets, access to trade routes, and a buffer against European rivals. Local rulers often kept a degree of autonomy, but ultimate authority flowed back to Istanbul. The empire's presence on African shores also gave rise to new cultural blends. Ottoman architecture mingled with North African traditions, while soldiers and sailors moved freely across the sea. For travelers, the coastline seemed dotted with fortresses flying the Sultan's banners. To rule both sides of the Mediterranean was to project power across two continents. These distant provinces remind us how truly vast the empire was, stretching from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Europe. Pirates in Ottoman service terrorized the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean in the 16th century was a restless sea, and many of its most feared pirates sailed under Ottoman protection. Known as corsairs, these seafarers raided European coasts, capturing ships, seizing treasure, and taking prisoners for ransom or slavery. Among them were legendary figures such as Barbarossa, who rose from pirate captain to admiral of the Ottoman fleet. With Istanbul's backing, the corsairs became an unofficial navy, projecting Ottoman power deep into European waters. To Christian kingdoms, they were scourges to the empire. They were useful allies, blending piracy with politics. For centuries, the Mediterranean echoed with the clash of corsair galleys and European warships. The Ottomans did not merely rule by land armies, they wielded chaos on the seas, turning piracy into an instrument of empire. In their wake, entire coastlines lived in fear of sudden sails appearing on the horizon. The empire was once led by a sultan who never left the palace. In the 17th century, Sultan Ibrahim I lived almost his entire reign within the palace walls, rarely venturing beyond its gilded gates. Known as Ibrahim the Mad by later historians, he spent much of his life secluded in the harem before unexpectedly becoming ruler. Once on the throne, he showed little interest in statecraft or warfare, preferring luxury and seclusion. Ministers and family members often made decisions in his place, while he indulged in extravagance. His reign was marked by instability, and he was eventually overthrown. Ibrahim's story highlights both the strength and fragility of Ottoman rule, an empire so powerful it could endure even under absent leadership, yet vulnerable when its sultan lost touch with reality. To imagine a ruler who never left the palace is to glimpse the strange, sometimes surreal turns that history can take. A fire once destroyed thousands of homes in Istanbul. Wooden houses, narrow streets, and crowded quarters made Istanbul vulnerable to devastating fires. In 1660, one of the most catastrophic blazes swept through the city, destroying thousands of homes and leaving tens of thousands homeless. Flames consumed markets, mosques, and entire districts, transforming vibrant neighborhoods into charred ruins. Survivors described the night sky glowing red as smoke blotted out the stars. In the aftermath, rebuilding began quickly, with grand new mosques and stone buildings rising in place of what had burned. Fires became part of the city's rhythm, feared yet inevitable in a metropolis of timber and wind. Each blaze was both a tragedy and a chance to reshape the urban fabric. The Great Fire of 1660 reminds us how fragile even the mightiest capitals could be, where centuries of life could vanish in a single night of roaring flames. Earthquakes shaped the fate of the capital. Istanbul, perched on the fault lines of Anatolia, has always lived under the shadow of earthquakes. In the Ottoman centuries, powerful quakes struck repeatedly, toppling minarets, cracking palace walls, and shaking the city to its foundations. One of the worst came in 1766, when much of the skyline was shattered. Mosques lost their domes, bridges collapsed, and thousands perished. For the Ottomans, earthquakes were reminders that even empire could not control nature's force. Yet the city always rebuilt, its resilience as enduring as its beauty. Stone was reset, domes rose again, and fountains once more filled the streets with water. The cycle of destruction and renewal shaped Istanbul's history, weaving catastrophe into its very identity. Each quake became both an end and a beginning, a moment when the capital trembled yet survived, holding fast to its role as the beating heart of empire. The Crimean War tested the empire's strength. In the 1850, the Ottoman Empire found itself at the center of one of Europe's great conflicts, the Crimean War. Allied with Britain and France, the Ottomans fought against Russia, struggling to defend their lands and influence. The war introduced modern technologies, including railways, telegraphs, and new kinds of weaponry, making it a brutal glimpse of industrial-age conflict. Though the Ottomans emerged on the winning side, the war revealed their growing dependence on European allies. For many, it marked the beginning of the empire's slow decline, when victories no longer came from its own strength alone. Yet the Crimean War also showed the Ottomans' determination to survive in a world of shifting powers. Soldiers marched, fleets clashed, and distant battlefields echoed with cannon fire, all as the empire fought desperately to remain a force in the modern age. The Ottoman railways connected continents. In the 19th century, the Ottomans embraced the age of steam. Railways began to spread across their lands, linking cities and regions in ways never before possible. Lines connected Istanbul to Europe, Damascus to Medina, and Anatolia to the Black Sea. The most ambitious was the Hejaz Railway, built to carry pilgrims across deserts toward the holy cities. These trains turned weeks of grueling travel into journeys of just days, changing how people and goods moved across continents. Railways also symbolized modernity, a declaration that the empire could still adapt and innovate. To see a locomotive steaming across the Ottoman landscape was to glimpse the future colliding with tradition. Steel tracks laid alongside caravan routes and ancient roads. Though many lines later fell into disrepair, their legacy remains, proof that the Ottomans once rode the rails into a new age. The First World War brought the empire to its end. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War in 1914, siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary. What followed was a devastating conflict that drained its resources and exposed its vulnerabilities. Battles raged in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus, leaving hundreds of thousands dead. By the war's end, the empire was exhausted, its lands occupied, and its authority shattered. The once mighty state that had endured for centuries collapsed under the weight of modern warfare. For ordinary people, the war meant hunger, displacement, and grief. For the empire, it was the final blow after years of decline. The end of the First World War did not just redraw borders, it closed the chapter on one of history's greatest empires. From triumphs on the battlefield to the silence of surrender, the Ottoman story ended as dramatically as it had begun, in the crucible of war. The Sultanate was abolished in the early 20th century. After the war, the empire's last remnants gave way to a new order. In 1922, the Sultanate was formally abolished, bringing to an end the centuries-old institution that had crowned Ottoman rulers. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British warship and sailed into exile, leaving Istanbul behind. For many, it was a moment of sorrow and shock. The empire that had once ruled 3 continents was gone. Yet it was also a beginning, as the Republic of Turkey rose in its place, forging a new identity for a new age. The fall of the Sultanate marked one of history's great transitions, when the world of palaces and janissaries gave way to parliaments and modern states. In that moment, the Ottomans passed into memory, their centuries of power transformed into history. The legacy of the Ottomans still shapes the world today. Though the empire itself has vanished, its influence still lingers across continents. From the mosques of Istanbul to the coffeehouses of Europe, from culinary traditions to legal systems, the Ottoman imprint remains visible in daily life. Borders drawn during its decline still define modern nations, while its architecture continues to inspire awe. The empire's mix of cultures, languages, and religions created a model of coexistence, often uneasy but enduring, that shaped the fabric of the Middle East, the Balkans, and beyond. Even in memory, the Ottomans evoke grandeur and complexity, a reminder of how deeply history can ripple into the present. To study their story is to see how empire leaves footprints not only in monuments, but in habits, cuisines, and customs that survive long after its banners fall. The Ottomans may be gone, but their echoes still whisper through our world. And so, our quiet journey through the story of the Ottoman Empire comes to a close. We have wandered through the grand palaces of Istanbul, paused beside fountains that once offered water to weary travelers, and listened to the echoes of soldiers marching across continents. We have glimpsed the lives of sultans, scholars, and ordinary people who lived under the domes and banners of empire. From treaties that lasted centuries to fires that reshaped the capital in a single night, the Ottomans left behind a legacy as vast as their reach, a legacy that still lingers in the world around us today. As the centuries unfolded, their empire rose and fell like the tide, at times brilliant with triumph, at times shaken by rebellion, and at last carried away by the winds of modern history. Yet through it all, they built wonders, preserved knowledge, and shaped the destinies of nations. To trace their story is to feel the pulse of history itself, beating through stone, song, and memory. Now, as you rest, let those stories drift softly through your thoughts, like lanterns floating across a quiet sea. The domes of Istanbul, the caravans on desert roads, the sails of corsairs in the Mediterranean, all dissolve into gentle impressions, fading into dreams. History reminds us that everything rises and falls, yet its echoes remain, carrying us forward, teaching us, and quietly surrounding us, even as we sleep. So, if your eyes are heavy now, you can let them close, knowing that the story continues in the silence of the night. Time itself has slowed, and the voices of the past have become a lullaby. Thank you for spending this time here on the Sleepy History Channel, a place for curious minds to rest. and for the mysteries of the past to become companions to your dreams. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through time, I invite you to like and subscribe, or share one of your favorite history facts down in the comments. It helps us bring more stories of the past to those who need a peaceful night. But for now, you need only drift, carried gently into sleep. And when you wake, the world will be waiting, shaped in ways seen and unseen by the echoes of empires that once were. Good night.